This morning after EU leaders last night reached a compromise on the bloc's €1.8 trillion budget and pandemic rescue package. The bill had been thrown into doubt last month when Poland and Hungary threatened a veto over conditions that tied receiving the money to democratic values. But as the clock ticked down and the fear of an economic cliff edge loomed, the Council presidency, held by Germany, was able to break the stalemate. Hermione G explains.
After weeks of standoff and the threat of delayed funding, the two sides found middle ground at Thursday's EU summit. The so-called rule of law mechanism remains in place, but it won't be applied until it's been reviewed by the European Court of Justice. All parties hailed the agreement as a victory.
And we could say, modestly of course, that we saved the unity of the Union. So don't forget that this dispute was not only about the rule of law regulation, financial issue, but it was about the future of European Union. This was only one step. There is still one more difficult obstacle, and this is the ratification of that agreement by the national parliaments.
We fight for our rights, we fight for clarity, we fight for certainty of law, and we fight for the treaties so that they are not circumvented by the secondary law. And all this was possible thanks to our cooperation.
The relief was also clear in the European institutions, with Council President Charles Michel tweeting that the bloc can start building back its economies. And the head of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said Europe moves forward. €1.8 trillion to power our recovery. The budget still needs to be approved by the European Parliament, and national parliaments will have to greenlight the additional €750 billion recovery fund. But for now, the political battle is over, even if it's not clear who won. Hermione G, Euronews.
Let's go to Brussels to find out a little bit more. Our correspondent Shona Murray is there for us. Shona, a very good morning to you. So finally a compromise and relief, I'm sure, in Brussels. But what was the cost of negotiating this?
Well, there's actually been quite a bit of negotiating in Brussels over the past 24 hours. In fact, EU leaders negotiated from 1 p.m. in the afternoon on Thursday, well after 9 a.m. in the morning. And of course, they discussed this issue of rule of law, also relations with Turkey. But the stickiest and most controversial issue happened to be climate change, which was only resolved around 8 o'clock in the morning, where the EU agreed to cut carbon emissions by 55% by 2030. But you're right, this issue of the rule of law was the major issue over the past few weeks because it blocked the progress of the EU budget, the 7-year budget, and the €750 billion rescue fund. And really, it's hard to know exactly who came out on top. If you hear Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, he thinks that he's the victor here in this one. Speaking to EU lawyers over the past 24 hours and late last night, they believe that there has been quite a strong compromise and watering down on the issue of rule of law by the EU, and it's probably quite unsatisfactory to many people. I mean, the mechanism remains in place, but it's suspended until Poland and Hungary take the legislation to the European Court of Justice to have it tested. In the meanwhile, for maybe a year and a half until that judgment comes through, you will have Poland and Hungary receiving tens of billions of euro and possibly being able to have carte blanche when it comes to rule of law. That's the fear, anyway, that some people have. But also what's interesting is that you have a consensus on the issue. Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who's very strongly in favour and been pushing for a strong rule of law mechanism, says he's satisfied with it. So we don't exactly know what the cost is, but just speaking to some lawyers, they believe that the EU has compromised on rule of law in order to get the budget passed. And I caught up with Professor Federico Fabrini from Dublin City University School of Law and Governance, and I asked him about this compromise.
Watering down the rule of law conditionality in the proposed regulation, there is a risk that the ability of the European Union and institutions to rein into dynamics of rule of law backsliding will be weaker. So in fact, I think the trade-off that leaders are facing and that the EU as a whole is facing is, shall we move ahead with this recovery fund, which is essential and needed, to kickstart the economy after the pandemic, but shall we do so at the price of sacrificing foundational values? And the choice between these two competing elements are not going to be easy, but it's clear that if the EU betrays its foundational values and fails to properly protect them, its future will be endangered.
Professor Federica Fabrini making the point there that the ability to prevent democratic backsliding in the EU, particularly in Poland and Hungary, has been probably weakened. But at the same time, of course, member states get access to the EU Recovery Fund and the EU budget. But you're right to ask the question, at what cost? Rosie?
So what happens now? And are leaders relatively happy with the agreement they've come to?
Yes, I think that's the point. There is a consensus. There was an agreement after a huge stumbling blocks and blockages over the past few weeks. I think everybody's happy that the budget and the recovery fund is going to pass. And I think that hurdle has now been passed. But we'll have to hear from the Parliament, from many MEPs who've been pushing for rule of law. I know that people like Sophie in 't Veld, the Dutch MEP, says she's very concerned about it. So over the coming days, we'll see the legislation more and more. We'll be able to unpick it and see what the Parliament has to say about it. Rosie?
Shona, thank you very much. Our correspondent there in Brussels.